So we have then with Gebser chapter 5, the space-time constitution of the structures. And in this chapter, it's a short one, he gives an analysis of the emergence of time, the three different types of time. In the magical structure, it's space-timelessness. So time as such really doesn't exist in the magical structure. But then he gives an account of the emergence of mythical temporicity from out of the magical nocturnal cavern, night sky, and then an account of mental time, in which time becomes triadic, past, present, future, and no longer cyclical in the mental consciousness structure. He doesn't talk about the integral in this chapter. So he gives these interesting theories for the emergence of temporality. The first thing he does is he gives an example on the space-timelessness of the magical structure by talking about the miracles that took place at Lourdes in France, that started in the end of the 19th century. And he takes as a given that the miraculous healings that took place there are factual and actually happened. And he says that what happens in that case is that when prayer is one of the main functions of the magical consciousness structure because it's sonic. There's always an address that's directed to a god who is supposed to be listening to one's requests. But what really happens, of course, has nothing to do with a deity or divinity. It has to do with the activation of the magical consciousness structure, which is based on unity. It unifies all the individuals who are present, all simultaneously in prayer for these miracles. And what it does is it effaces the individual's sense of selfhood. The individual drops back into the magical cavern world in which all the various organs of the body are, as it were, in resonance with everyone else's organs who are there in prayer at this sacred locale. And because we have all these healthy organs of these individuals who are all praying simultaneously, they set up a resonance, like Sheldrake's idea of the morphic resonance. They set up a resonance such that it affects and changes the unhealthy organs of the sick individuals there and actually has the effect of healing them through the activation of the magical consciousness structure. I think that's a really fascinating idea, and it has nothing to do with a divinity. Prayer is simply the projection outward onto an imaginary being of an activation of the magical consciousness structure. And the same thing happens when a yogi descends in through meditation down into those deep levels of deep dreamless sleep, and beyond that to turiya, the silence, where he attains samadhi, and then can perform miracles, and actually can really perform miracles because his consciousness has dissolved itself, lost its individuality, and descended down into this archaic ground of being. So that's the example that he gives for the space-timelessness of the magical consciousness structure. And then he moves on to a discussion of how the mythical consciousness structure developed a sense of what he calls temporicity now from the space-timelessness of the magical consciousness structure. So if we imagine the magical consciousness structure as this realm in which the nighttime sky is this closed, static cavern, and I think it really was the case that in the Paleolithic, the nighttime sky really was regarded as a gigantic cave, which conversely the artwork painted on the walls of the caves at Les Trois Frères and Lascaux and Altamira were actually, the animals that were painted on the walls of these caves were actually constellations. There's a German scholar named Michael Rappenglück who figured this out, that a number of the petroglyphs at Lascaux, there's a giant bull at Lascaux with 6 dots appearing above it in the exact spot where in the constellation of Taurus we do indeed find the Pleiades. There are 7 stars in the Pleiades, but only 6 of them are easily visible. And if so, this would be the oldest representation of Taurus in history. Lascaux goes back to 15,000 BC. And at the same site in the so-called shaft of the dead man, where we have the famous image of the bison and the shaman with the bird's head and the staff with the bird's head, he says that each of the eyes of these 3 figures represents one of the stars in the summer triangle. Deneb, Altair, and Vega are the 3 key stars there, which creates the summer triangle. And if that were the case, then the man with the arms out like this, with the bird's head, is in just exactly the same position in which we would expect to find the constellation of Cygnus, which is the swan that flies along the Milky Way, and may have been imagined as a shaman flying on a bird up the river of the dead. The Milky Way is primordially imagined as the river of the dead, going all the way back here into the Paleolithic. So I think that it was really the case that in the Paleolithic the nighttime sky was imagined as a gigantic cave, and the Paleolithic caves themselves were imagined as miniature caves that miniaturized the static, unmoving, eternal, spaceless, timeless mystery of these animal configurations on the vault of the cosmic world ceiling. In his discussion then of the emergence, he talks about the myth of Kronos, the Greek myth of Kronos. Kronos as a figure personifying the nighttime sky. Kronos is the god who has a sickle. The sickle is the lunar crescent, of course. And the myth of Kronos is that he separates Uranos, the god of the starry, spangled night sky. Uranos later becomes our planet Uranus. Uranos is separated, is in sexual union with Gaia, and he comes in and castrates the genitals of his father Uranos and separates the two. So we have this primordial mythical separation of the world parents into polar opposites, and then he becomes the reigning god, and out of a paranoia that another god will come to displace him, he begins devouring up all the other Olympian gods, and then the goddess Metis concocts a poison, has him drink it, and after he drinks it, he throws up and disgorges all the gods, one of whom is, of course, Zeus, and Zeus then comes along and overthrows him, and then casts him down into Hades, which is, of course, a miniaturization of the ancient mythical cavern world, which is pushed now down beneath the earth as the Olympian sky gods begin to come into being. As Gebser says, Zeus is not in a cavern, he's on the top of Mount Olympus now. All of that matters. And so the myth really is a victory of wakefulness over the sleeping, somnolent aspect of the magical structure. And he points out that the Kronos is named Ker, the prefix, the Kr prefix, is a transformation of an older set of word prefixes that have to do with Kel, K-E-L, which has to do with the words that have a magical consciousness structure reference, because Kel words such as the goddess Kali, the calyx of a flower, Clytemnestra, all of these Kel words have a primordial meaning of burrowing down into the earth, sheltering into the earth. All of these Kel words have this prefix to them that links them with the magical consciousness structure and its cosmology, whereas words with Ker, in which the L, K-E-R, the K-E-L becomes K-E-R, and Kel moves from Ker, and Gebser says you can even see the movement in the mouth when you pronounce Kel. The mouth forms a cave when the tongue closes up on the L, Kel, but when it says Ker, it's open. And so you, even in the word itself, you have the movement out of the cavern of the mouth into words such as circle, kuklos, koros. All words that have the etymological root K-E-R have the meaning of the mythical circular motion. And so Kronos is the god now who takes and inherits the ancient Paleolithic cavern cosmos, which is static and unmoving, spaceless, timeless, and begins to set it into motion. And indeed, when we look back at what I think of as the period of the earliest origins of the mythical consciousness structure, which is to say in the late Neolithic, the pottery Neolithic, when we look at Samaran pottery, Samara was an ancient site dating from 6000 BC on the Tigris River, where pottery was painted and it was put in the graves of the dead. There was a cemetery there at Samara, and also at another site called Tel Es-Sawan. These pots had, on the bottoms of them, they had painted images of animals moving in counterclockwise motion around a center, which I believe to be one of the earliest images of the constellations moving in counterclockwise rotation around the pole star. And so right there, in exactly the epoch in which the ancestor cult is beginning to fade away, and pottery is coming in, and an awareness of seasonality and the cyclicity of the seasons and seasonal festivals coming in, we find this image of the cosmos being set into turning motion now, right at that point. So we're moving into the circle of mythical temporicity that Gebser talks about here. And so that's the myth of Kronos, and the linkage of the words Kel moves into Ker. and later the key archaic root for the mental will be words having to do with reg, R-E-G, which has to do, of course, with right, recht, right, law, masculine, paternal, shifting to consciousness, words having to do with that have been derived from that root. Gebser has a fascination with language and with seeing the evolution of these consciousness structures in these word roots that change over time as the consciousness structures configure. Then he moves into an account of the emergence of time, triadic time now, no longer circular time in the mental consciousness structure, in which time becomes past, present, future. It's triadic, it's split apart. And he says that there's a Hebrew ritual that was practiced where the Hebrews would punish their prisoners of war by laying them on the threshing floor, in which a sled called a tribolos that had runners on it underneath it. It was pulled by 3 horses, and it had runners on it underneath it made out of razor-sharp stones, and the horses, driven by a goddess in Greek, she becomes a goddess named Deis, D-A-I-S, who drives this over these captive prisoners and carves them up. And he says that the word day that we have it in Latin, this is dies, the word day comes from an Indo-Germanic root syllable da, which means to dice, to divide, to carve up, so that the word day already means to carve up and partition the night. The day carves and cuts the night, just as the mental consciousness structure carves up the mandalas that the mythical consciousness structure had configured and centered in Ouroboros fashion around the great high civilizations. So already you can see this coming in this mythic practice where this goddess drives these 3 horses, and he says the 3 horses are linked to the 3 phases of the moon, so that they still have a nocturnal aspect, but that the mythical sacrifice is now becoming deficient in this barbaric practice, and the goddess of the day is beginning to come in, and we're beginning to see the configuration of time from mythical temporicity. He does not mention, surprisingly, that the whole idea of a cosmological time that is not circular. He does group the Magian civilization in with the mental consciousness structure. The whole thing is part of the mental consciousness structure, although he overlooks, I think, as I've said elsewhere, the fact that the very word Magian consciousness structure that Spengler gives this, and its cosmology is cavern-like, suggests that it's actually a secondary phase, a recrudescence or a resurgence of the magical consciousness structure, but nonetheless he groups it into the mental consciousness structure. And indeed it was the Zoroastrians that invented this idea of a linear time with an absolute beginning, a middle period of history when a savior figure comes in, or a prophet like Zoroaster, and then an end of time in which another savior figure, a Saushant, or the second Christ who comes at the end of time, to judge the damned and separate in an act of thermodynamic reversal of entropy, separates out the damned from the blessed. They go in 2 different directions into hell, and so forth. That cosmology of a 12,000-year arc of a definite beginning, a climax, and an ending of history without a repetition, without an eternal return of history, did indeed begin with the Magian civilization, the Zoroastrians, and the Hebrews inherited that cosmology from the Zoroastrians. They changed the 12,000-year arc to a 4,000-year arc, but they adapted it and transformed it to the historical conditions of their culture. So that is the upshot of this chapter. It's a short one, and it shows the evolution of these different types of temporality. He had already discussed the emergence in one of the first 2 chapters, the emergence of spatiality, the mental spatiality from the magical and mythical cavern world, and this chapter just discusses the temporal, the 3 different types of time. In the next chapter he moves into a much longer discussion of the history of the phenomena of soul and spirit, which we'll do next.